Okay, so now we're going to start. This is the last class, I hope, I think. Not because I'm not enjoying this, but because it's been a long series, all on the same theme, getting along with each other when there are competing values, particularly religious values uh, that that are bringing about conflict between Jews, and how we get along when those conflicts arise. We started off from early sources in rabbinic literature. As I said last week, we started off in this strange area of Jewish law that relates to the tithing of produce. And last week, we're already at a very modern dilemma. How do you have lunch with somebody at your home when you know they won't be saying a blessing on the food that is served to them? Are you responsible for that? So you see how this one little area of Jewish law expands and expands and expands until it actually becomes really relevant to many of the challenges that we're facing today. Today's concluding class has the theme, I guess, or the subject, um, very ominous kind of subject. What is it that we're trying to build, and what is it that we are afraid of? That is, so far, I think we've been exploring the topic, but maybe we haven't spent time understanding what really is at stake here when we talk about people going over to each other's house for lunch. In a certain way, you could look at everything we've learned and said, well, this is all about being able to sit at a table together. But what I'm hoping to show you today is that actually there are far greater implications uh, in these questions than we may even realize at first. And in order to do that, we're going to look at some other sources from rabbinic literature, and I think those will reveal what we are really nervous about. Now, next week there is going to be a class, but it's not going to be enmity and comedy. It's going to be on Hanukkah. We have 2 weeks, and I think we'll cover an interesting subject. You'll see the emails for it, but we're going to take an interesting approach to the role of light and darkness in the literature of the Sfat Emet, who is a famous Hasidic uh, a rabbi who wrote a brilliant commentary on the Torah called the Sfat Emet. That's why he's called Sfat Emet, and or the Sfas Emes. And I hope you'll join me for that class next week. But for now, on to enmity and comity. I will share my screen with you. Can you give me a thumbs up if you can see it? Okay. So, Lou, would you do us the honor of reading this short passage from Mishna Chagiga, and then I will explain.
Sure. There is a stringency with regard to purity preparations for sacrificial food that does not apply to truma. We allow those within other vessels for truma, but not for sacrificial food.
Thank you, Lou. Now, there's a lot here. I'm going to have to break it down for everybody. For some of you who maybe don't understand what the Mishnah is talking about here. Well, in the time of the temple, just like in today's time, it was very important for the vessels and the food that was being served in the temple to be pure. Actually, we don't realize that many of the laws of kashrut that we follow today actually come from the purity ceremonies, or the purity methods that were in use at the time of the temple. Because what made a vessel pure to serve in the temple would obviously, we learn from that, make such a vessel pure if, let's say, milk and meat had been mixed in that bowl, or if it had been served for non-kosher food, and now you wanted to serve it for kosher food. So there is a rule here that we are learning that in this Mishnah that has to do with how we kosher, or we would call it kosher. They call it mitaher, how you purify these vessels, okay, how you work them. So they separate in the Mishnah two different kinds of vessels. There are vessels that are used for truma. Now remember, we learned truma. What is truma? That is the portion of the food that gets served to the priest. He eats the kohen. He eats the truma. Remember, truma is separated from all the produce, and it is considered to be a major sin to eat truma if you are not a priest. So it has to be given to him so that he can eat it, right? It's eaten in the temple, but it's eaten directly by him. It's not placed on the altar. It's his food. That is different from kodesh. Okay, do you see that word here in the Hebrew? Kodesh. Truma is not offered on the altar. Kodesh, sacrificial food, what is called in the English sacrificial food, that is placed on the altar. So in the ladder of holiness, which vessels have to be the most pure, like that are the most important vessels? Obviously, those are the vessels that are placed at the altar, and then less so the ones that are eaten by the priests. So we're learning in this Mishnah that there is a chumrah. A chumrah, some of you may have heard that word before. A chumrah means a stringency. There's a chumrah bakodesh, mi batruma. There is a stringency with regard to kodesh vessels that does not exist with regard to truma vessels. What is it? It has to do with tevila. Tevila is the dunking of those vessels. So some of you may have some friends, or you may have done it yourselves, who still today, they take their dishes that they bought at Canadian Tire before they use it for the first time, they take it to the mikvah. And what do they do with them? They toivel their dishes. That's one of the elements of koshering that goes back to the time of the temple. In order to purify the vessel, this isn't to make the vessel kosher, it's to purify it, right? The rationale is maybe the vessel was used for an improper purpose before it was shipped to Canadian Tire and I bought it. So in order to make sure that it's pure, I'm going to toivel it in the mikvah. Now, how I go about toiveling, how you do it, is what we are discussing here in this Mishnah. Because I can be lenient if it's just truma dishes, but I can't be lenient if it's dishes that are kodesh, that will be served on the altar. And what is the leniency that we're talking about now? Matbilin kalim betoch kalim. We allow the immersion of vessels with other vessels. So think about this. This is how I think about it in my head. When you go to the mikvah, today, if I was going to go to the mikvah to toivel my dishes, they usually have, there's this big sort of, I don't know how to describe it, almost like how you might catch lobster. It's like this big crate with no top on it, but there's a crate with some wire on the side. And since it would take a really long time to take every dish and put it in the mikvah one by one, I mean, today you buy a whole big set. So you put all the plates in the box, that waterproof box with holes in it, all in there, and you lower it down into the mikvah, and then you pull it back up. Now, one might say, well, that's not enough. Why? Because when you put dishes together in that box, isn't it possible that one was touching the other, one pot was touching another pot, and that at that point of contact, the water didn't get there. And therefore, it's not pure, because if even a piece of it isn't pure, then the whole thing is not pure. That's a rule when you go to the mikvah. It's actually even a rule when a person goes to a mikvah, that the water has to surround you entirely. If I'm wearing a wedding ring, or often the case an ear piercing, right? It doesn't count. You can't go to the mikvah with the ring in your ear. Why? Who cares? Well, it's because then the water can't get all over your body. There's a ring in your ear, or an earring that's blocking the water. So we have to be extra careful. And when we go to the mikvah, we make sure that that there's no earrings on us. But when it comes to purifying the vessels, I hope everyone now is with me, that you all understand what is the stringency that we're going to require for kodesh and not for truma, for food that's placed on the altar. The dishes cannot go one on top of the other. If you have that big bowl, that big box, you have to put one plate on it, and it's one at a time. We are more strict. We have a chumrah with kodesh that doesn't exist with truma. Now, I know you're saying, well, what the heck does this have to do with anything? Well, you know my methodology. First, we got to learn something, and then we're going to get to why this is relevant and important. But let's just all make sure we understand the basics. When it comes to truma, we're lenient. We can do a whole bunch of dishes at once. When it comes to kodesh, we're strict. Can't do a whole bunch of dishes at once. It has to be one at a time. Now, here we come to the Talmud that's going to try and understand what is going on here. Why is it that we are strict for one, but lenient for the other? Okay, who shall I pick on to read this morning? Adele, would you be kind enough to read for us from the Talmud?
Sure. Okay. The Gemara offers two technical explanations for our concerns around immersing vessels inside vessels. Notes that the concern should apply equally to all cases of immersion, and asks, why don't we forbid immersion of vessels within vessels for truma as well?
So here, what you understand the question? I mean, I sort of knew. I study Talmud, so this is sort of an obvious question that the Talmud would ask. If you're saying that you can't be too sure that when you put a whole bunch of vessels in the box that they actually all get koshered, well, why wouldn't you also say when it comes to truma dishes that you should also be strict and go one by one and not put them all in at the same time? Are you you're in such a hurry that you don't have time to go one by one? You have to do them all at the same time. So what is it that's really going on here that makes us lenient in one case and strict in the other? And just read this sentence for me, Adele, and
Okay.
you'll see what the answer is.
Because we are speaking to Haverim, educated members of the rabbinic class who are careful about purity laws, and Haverim know how to avoid the problems
Go ahead.
potentially involved in immersing vessels within.
Here's the answer. It's not because we're in a rush and we want to get it over with. It comes back to our famous distinction between Jews. because there are two kinds of Jews in the rabbinic mind. We have Am Haaretz, and Am Haaretz are not knowledgeable in all the laws. But we have Chaverim, and Chaverim do know the laws, and we trust them. They are educated members of the rabbinic class who are careful about purity laws. And they know when they put the dishes in the box, that box that you can dunk in the mikvah, they know not to put one on top of the other. They know to separate. They will know how to do it in a way where we can be guaranteed that the entire vessel will be immersed in the mikveh and we won't have any problems. This is not about time, about being short on time. It's about trusting people to do the right thing. And sometimes, if it's a person you don't trust, they have to be more careful. But if it's a person you do trust, they can do the job a little faster because they know the rules, they know to do it the right way. Okay? But that's going to lead us to the next obvious sort of question, Adele.
Okay, then why don't we let them avoid these problems even when it comes to preparing sacrificial food?
Right. So if you're saying we can trust the Chaverim because they know what they're doing, so let's trust the Chaverim. Let them dunk the dishes, both that are for the Kohanim and the dishes that will go to the altar. Why one and not the other if they know what they're doing? Okay, now here's a really interesting answer. Go ahead, Adele. You're muted, Adele.
I see that. Okay.
Okay.
Because an haaretz, one of the unlettered masses, will see a chaver perform such an immersion and will act similarly himself, but not know how to be careful in the way the chaver knows.
Okay. Let's just stop there for a second because a lot of you have brought this up in the past few weeks. You've said to me, you've talked about marit ayin. Marit ayin. You didn't know you were talking about marit ayin, but that's what we call it in Jewish law, marit ayin. What does marit ayin means? It means sometimes you have to do things in a stricter way, lest somebody see you and think that you're doing something wrong. And then they themselves will say, well, if Rabbi Grover can do that, then certainly I can. When that person doesn't know the facts of what's actually going on. So the classic example of this is the McDonald's on the highway. I'm in my car with my kids and someone has to go to the bathroom and the only place to go is McDonald's. And it just so happens that you, Adele, are in the same parking lot, just taking a rest, and you see, oh my God, Steve, look at this. Look what I'm looking at. Grover's going into McDonald's with his whole family. They're not wearing kippot. I bet you they're ordering bacon cheeseburgers and all this stuff. It's all a fraud. Let's call the shul right now. We got to fire him. That's marit ayin. So some would say a rabbi should never walk into a McDonald's even to get a glass of water, because no one will understand that that's all you're doing there, because that's not the typical reason why people walk into McDonald's. And then actually the concern is not that I'm going to get in trouble. That's not what we're worried about. It's not that you're going to turn to Steve and say, I caught him. It's that you're going to turn to Steve and say, I guess it's okay now to eat at McDonald's. I guess they're kosher. Now, I guess it's a bit of an extreme example. You wouldn't think that, right? But in a less extreme example, you might think to yourself, oh, the rabbis changed the rules, and I guess this is kosher, because if it's good enough for Rabbi Grover, it's certainly good enough for us. And then you go in and you order a number 3, and then I'm at fault. I'm the one who caused you to eat that non-kosher food because I went in there and for an unusual reason, and it led to marit ayin. And that is exactly, a number of you have mentioned that to me over the course of this class. Doesn't our behavior, don't we have to be concerned with our behavior? Because what we do, the decisions we make, those may have an impact on others. They'll be looking at us and seeing what we're doing, and they'll be upset, or it will lead them astray, right? And this is what the Talmud notes. And you should underline this because we finally have a source that speaks to that concern. What is the Talmud worried about? That if I, a chaver, if someone sees me using kodesh dishes, putting them in the mikvah in that way, in other words, like piling one on top of another, then that person, the Haaretz, will say, well, I guess that's good enough. I guess I don't have to be so concerned with the way I take my dishes to the mikvah. I guess I don't have to be so concerned, because if it's good enough for Grover to put them all in at the same time, then it's good enough for us, right? And if we allow leniency with the case of a chaver, that might create problems with an Am Haaretz. An Am Haaretz doesn't know the rules and therefore should always act with stringency, should always act more carefully. And even we have to change our behavior and be strict, just in case an Am Haaretz walks by and says, hey, look, they're not serious anymore about the laws of purifying dishes. Everyone's just doing a whole bunch of them at the same time. But that leads to the next question, right? Adele, go ahead and read the next question. But then...
Okay. But then we should be similarly concerned that an Am Haaretz will see a chaver perform such an immersion in the context of truma.
Okay, excellent. So this is a typical Talmudic discussion of someone says something and then they attack them because of logic. Okay, so I know it can be a bit tricky to follow along, but it actually makes sense if you follow with the logic, right? I just said to you that we need to be strict, even though we're knowledgeable. Let's say it's all a bunch of chaverim. We're the knowledgeable people. We know the rules. We're going to be really careful when we take our dishes to the mikvah. But the rabbi still allowed leniency when it comes to the truma dishes, the dishes that go to the Kohen. So that's a logical problem, because the Talmud just said we shouldn't act leniently lest an Am Haaretz walk by and see that we're toveling in an irresponsible way, that we're taking our dishes to the mikveh in an irresponsible way. And then he himself tovels his dishes in an irresponsible way. But there's a logical problem here, because maybe the Am Haaretz doesn't know whether the dishes I'm taking are altar dishes or truma dishes that go to the priest. How's he supposed to know which dishes I'm using? So if the rule is we should be strict, then we should be strict for both. Strict for kodesh and strict for truma. Strict for the dishes that go on the altar, strict for the dishes that go to the priest. Everyone understands there's a logical problem here. If I'm worried about what other people are going to see, then I should be strict in all circumstances. So what does the Talmud answer to this problem, Adele?
Okay. We don't accept teruma from an
You see, don't worry. If an Am Haaretz told you this is a truma dish, I'm giving you this dish so that it can be given to the priests and they can eat their food, we say thanks, but no thanks. So we would never accept that dish from them anyway. So don't worry about being lenient with those dishes. So apparently what we learn is that the truma dishes must have looked different. I'm just assuming this, and some other later commentators on the Talmud say the same thing. that it would be obvious to everyone that the truma dishes were different than the kodesh dishes, which would actually make sense in the same way that we have meat and milk in our house and everyone has different colored meat plates than dairy plates so that you shouldn't confuse them. So in the temple, they obviously had different looking truma plates than different looking kodesh plates. And then when the Aretz walks by, he sees, oh, look, they're being very careful with their kodesh dishes, doing it one by one. I guess I should do the same with my kodesh dishes and use them one by one. And if we're afraid that the person will say, oh, look, they're being lenient with their truma dishes, I can be lenient also with my truma dishes. That's when we say to them, sorry, we don't take truma dishes from you anyway, so we're not worried. Thanks for your truma dishes, but you can keep them. We're not interested. Now, what's the obvious question going to be here? Before we read the Talmud, I mean, if you're following the logic of this, you're following the discussion. So we're not going to take truma dishes from an Am Haaretz, the less important dishes, but we are going to take the kodesh dishes from them? Are you all with me here? Like, that's where we've ended up. Don't worry about the truma dishes. If you don't have to be careful with them because we wouldn't accept anyway truma dishes from them. But we are going to accept their kodesh dishes. If we're so concerned about the purity of what's served in the temple, well, why would we take kodesh dishes from them? And that's where this becomes interesting. Go ahead, Adele.
Okay, then why don't we solve the problem in the case of immersions for the purposes of sacrificial food by saying that we won't accept sacrificial meat from Haaretz?
Right. So in other words, exactly what I'm saying. Why don't we just solve this whole thing by saying we don't take any meat, any vessels from an Am Haaretz? And then I can put all my dishes in the mikvah at once. We can do this very quickly because we're all chaverim. We know what we're doing. There's no reason to be strict. There's no reason to be worried about what an Am Haaretz might see if he walks by as I'm toiveling the dishes. Let's just say we don't take any dishes from them. And what's the answer?
That would create enmity.
That's the reason. Let's look here at the Hebrew. I like to show you these key words so you see that I'm not making this up. Havia le Eva. Havia le Eva. If I told a Am Haaretz who may be not so knowledgeable, I understand, in all the rules, but the person is still a proud Jew, is still a member of the community. If I told him, you are not good enough to offer your dishes to be used on the altar at the temple, that would create enmity. Now go ahead, Adele. It's interesting because then they say, well, that would create enmity, but not the truma dishes. They don't care that you're not going to accept the truma dishes from them. Go ahead.
Doesn't the case of teruma create enmity? No, the Am Haaretz does not care in that case because he can just go give it to his friend who is an Am Haaretz priest.
So this is interesting. Apparently, we also have different classes of priests. There are priests who are more observant, and there are priests who are less observant, which actually, if you think about it, makes sense because how does one become a priest? You're just born that way. So just like everybody else has characteristics, some more fastidious than others, some more concerned about the details than others, well, so must priests have some that are more careful about the rules and some that are less careful about the rules. So even though the rabbis are saying, look, we won't take the plates, the Kohanim among us We're not going to take the plates from an Am Haaretz, but what we'll do is we'll take the plate and we'll give it to our friend. We have this friend who's not so careful about these things. I would say they wouldn't take the plates. They'd probably just say to the Am Haaretz, they'd say, "Oh, we have enough plates. We don't need yours. But I know there's a priest that lives down the road. His name is Joe, and he would love your dishes. Why don't you take your dishes to him?" And then that person will be satisfied, thinking that his plates were used to help the priests. But that's a different story when it comes to the kodesh stuff. The plates that are going to be used on the altar, there is only one altar. That is the key here. There is only one temple. There is only one altar. There is no Am Haaretz altar and Chaver altar. There's no altar for the upper class and upper for the lower class. And so we will be stringent with those. That is, that we're going to be careful with the way we toivel them, so that anybody who sees how we take those dishes to the mikvah will be equally careful. But not just that, that we'll be careful with the way we dunk them. That's the minor point. The major point is we have to accept those dishes from the Am Haaretz. Because to say to a Jew that they cannot give of their plates, their possessions, to the temple because they're just not good enough or smart enough or careful enough or observant enough, that is not acceptable. That is not a tolerable situation. We have to take everybody's plates and bring them to the altar, because there's only one temple, there's only one altar, and there's only one place that Jews can come and feel that unity. And if I would say we're not taking plates from Am Haaretz because we're concerned about the way they're dunking their plates, that would create a schism in the Jewish people. And that's actually what we're going to read in the way the Talmud ends. So go ahead and wrap this up for us, Adele.
Okay. Which teacher is concerned about an enmity? It is Rabbi Yossi, for it is taught, said Rabbi Yossi, why are all people, irrespective of their actual attentiveness to the laws of tithing, trusted with respect to the purity of wine and oil the whole year round, so that each and every person doesn't go off and build an altar for themselves, their own red heifer.
Here we go. Here we go. This is how we're ending this class. This is what this is all about. Adele, you did such a good job reading that. Can you please read that sentence one more time, so that each
and every person doesn't go off and build an altar for themselves and burn their own red heifer.
Everyone underline that line, highlight that line, cut it out of the PDF and put it on your fridge. That is why I love Rabbi Yossi. Rabbi Yossi is my guy. This course should be called Rabbi Yossi's version of Judaism. This is what's motivating him. 2,000 years ago, Rabbi Yossi said, this is what I'm worried about. If we don't take the wine and we don't take the oil, which are both ingredients used in the offerings at the temple. Hello, everybody here who comes to shul and davens Musaf, right? Shnei chavasim b'nei shana tamimu, shnei esranim soled mincha belula b'shemen. B'shemen, what's shemen? Hello, Hanukkah next week. Shemen is oil. And then the ayin is mentioned also in those verses. Wine and oil was used. They were used in the offerings of the temple. And just like they present the same problem as the dishes. Actually, this is a really nice segue to Hanukkah next week, right? What was the whole problem on when they came and rededicated the temple? They couldn't find any pure oil. What is pure oil? It's oil that was actually picked from the tree for the purpose of being used in the temple. Segregated, even the olive itself segregated to be used in the temple. That's what makes it pure olive oil. I can't go to Costco and take that oil and then bring it to the temple. So how do I know that you're not mixing the oil you bought from Costco with pure oil? How do I know? Well, I don't know. All I can do is trust you. And if you're a chaver, I trust you. But hold on. The Am Haaretz also has olive trees. He also has wine. He also wants to contribute to the temple offerings. What is going to happen if I go up to the Am Haaretz and tell him, sorry, I don't trust your wine, I don't trust your olives, because I know you're not careful with the laws of tithing. I know you're not careful with the rules. You're not, part of the elite class. What might that farmer do? What are we really worried about that farmer might do? Is it enmity that's the worry? Well, that's part of it, but that's not the main worry. The main worry is that farmer says, you think I'm not good enough for you? My care with regards to the way I observe Judaism isn't good enough for you? Well, guess what? You have your altar. I'm going to go build my altar. I will build a different shul with a different rabbi and different rules. And in that shul, my produce, what I do, will be accepted. That is what Rabbi Yossi is teaching. And read how this concludes, Adele.
Said Rabbi Papa, on whose authority do we accept the testimony of Am Haaretz nowadays? On Rabbi Yossi.
So this worry even extends to the rules of testimony in the court. In the mind of a rabbinic elite, of a rabbi, one of the elite people who are really careful with their laws of observance, they would say, well, you can't bring a witness to the court who is an Am Haaretz because they are not trustworthy. But the practical repercussions of that, the fact that you are excluding a whole class of Jews from the legal system, from being able to provide testimony in the courts, that is the kind of move that would create a break in the Jewish people. And not only might that create a break within the people, and we're talking here about a break in the ritual sort of areas of Judaism. You might have two temples, but here we're even saying you might have two courthouses. If we don't accept the testimony of an Am Haaretz, we might have two courthouses, because there are some decisions that will create enmity, that will fundamentally destroy the unity of the Jewish people. And Rabbi Yossi says, we never, ever go that far. I cannot rationally tell you that I trust the wine of an Am Haaretz. I can't. I cannot rationally tell you that I trust their oil. I cannot rationally tell you that I trust their plates. I cannot rationally tell you that I trust their testimony. But the price we will pay by bringing shame on their true religious passions is a price that will break apart the Jewish people. And that is more important than purity. That is more important than being certain that the dishes on the altar are pure. This is a beautiful, beautiful, beautiful section of the Talmud. Because the priests themselves, if you notice what's happening here, the priests themselves are not comfortable eating on the dishes of an Am Haaretz. They're saying, if you're an Am Haaretz, we don't want your dishes. You go bring them to that Am Haaretz priest. But your dishes aren't good enough for us. But that sense of being able to maintain your purity, they only express it because they think there's a way out. There's a way that a situation like that won't create enmity. But there is no alternative when it comes to the dishes and the vessels that are used in the temple. There's only one temple. There is no alternative. And so we will be more lenient with the temple than the altar. The holy altar will be more lenient with that in some respect than we will be with our own dishes and plates. Because I'm just a guy. If I don't eat from your plate, you'll hate me. But if I tell you you can't use your plate in my temple, if you can't use your plate in my shul, that is going to make somebody go out and start their own shul. Somebody will go out and create a competing temple. And that's worse than impure dishes. Who likes Rabbi Yossi? It's interesting. He is cited here not just as an authority with regard to these cases of the... How's that? Can you hear me? Are we back? Okay, connection restored. Baruch Mechayeh HaMeitim. Blessed is the one who brings life to the dead internet connection. Okay. Adele.
Yes.
All right. Now you can you see the source on the screen?
Huh?
All right. Let's read this last Tosafot.
Okay. Rabbeinu Elhanan
So
said,
remember, the Tosafot are sources from the Middle Ages. So we're now 1,000 years later, right? These are the grandchildren of Rashi who comment on the text of the Talmud. And here, what are they saying?
okay, Rabbeinu Elhanan says that we hold like Rabbi Yossi, and we are concerned for enmity. Therefore, we make a joint grace after meals with any Am Haaretz, despite the fact that we say in Brachot that we should not do this with an Am Haaretz.
So you see, look at this ruling of Rabbi Yossi being applied to many other situations in Jewish law when we want to include people who we might make an argument ought not to be included because they're not as careful with the laws as we are. So if I'm making a joint grade after meals, there is a ruling that says you shouldn't make grace after meals with somebody who is not as careful with as you are. Now, why is that? Because that person may not be eating kosher food. So if I'm sitting at a table and I see somebody is a Jewish person is eating, but I don't see what they're eating, am I allowed to invite them to make a zimun? There's a rule in Judaism, right? That when 3 people are having a meal together, that they shouldn't make birkat hamazon separately. They should make a zimun. The 3 of them should say together, Rabotai nevarech, Yehi Shem Hashem vorach. You know the song? That brings everybody into the circle to say birkat hamazon. You might think that I wouldn't bring in somebody at the table into my zimun who's an am haaretz, but think for yourselves about a situation like that. So I'm sitting at a table. I've got 3 friends, and I ask them, "Hey guys, will you join in Birkat Hamazon with me?" But not Steve. I'm sorry, I'm picking on Steve today a lot, Adele, but you'll ask him my forgiveness. Everyone, Adele is married to Steve. That's why I'm asking forgiveness. So Steve, you don't join in because you're an am haaretz. Imagine the kind of enmity that would create. So it's on Rabbi Yossi's authority that we say, you include Steve, because you're going to have a fight among Jews. You're going to create a situation of hate between people. What, you don't think I'm good enough to say Birkat Hamazon with you? Okay, go ahead.
But I'm not sure what the next thing says.
Yeah, but the Ri. So the Rabbi Ri is Rabbi Yitzchak.
Oh, okay. But Rabbi Yitzchak explains that not everyone who wants to deem themselves a scholar can do so for the purposes of refusing to say grace jointly with an haaretz.
So the Ri has an interesting opinion. Here we start to smell that old voice of religious superiority again. The Ri says, well, if you're a scholar, you shouldn't be asking Steve to join you in Birkat Hamazon. If you're, so look at how, don't we love Jews boxing people into categories? And it always leads to the same problems, the same nightmares. The Ri says, well, there's different kinds of Jews that can call themselves chaverim. Okay, yeah, there's am haaretz, there's people who are ignorant. But among the Jews that are in the rabbinic class, we have regular rabbinic class Jews, but we have other people who are called Talmidei Chachamim. Talmidei Chachamim are scholars, and it is not appropriate for a scholar to invite an am haaretz to say Birkat Hamazon with him. But look at what the Tosafot fire back on this.
We don't presume ourselves to be scholars with respect to this matter.
Which is another way of Tosafot saying, shut up, Rabbi Yitzchak. You are an extremist. You are going to create a major fight between Jews. When we start arguing at the table, I mean, can you imagine how humiliating this would be if we start arguing at the table? Well, you can say Birkat Hamazon with Steve, but not me. I'm a Talmid Chacham, and he's not good enough for my standards. So the Tosafot said, on this issue, don't consider yourself to be a scholar. You can put your ribbon, that feather in your cap, put it aside. When we have lunch together, we're just people. I think it is remarkable, right? Throughout this whole series, one of the remarkable things that I think has appeared and reappeared has been the theme of having a meal together. Different Jews from different backgrounds and different levels of knowledge. So much so that the Tosafot say, on this matter. What do you think they mean when they're saying on this matter? What they mean is, when it comes to lunch, when it comes to dinner, when it comes to sharing food, there is no Talmid Chacham, there's no Am Haaretz, there's no Chaver. When it comes to lunch, we're all the same. And you take your superiority and leave it for some other place. We are on board with Rabbi Yossi. Rabbi Yossi says there are such fundamental human acts of relationship building that when it comes to those acts, we must put our differences aside. One of those fundamental acts is the temple, our ability to join together and worship at the altar. One altar for every Jew. And one of those acts is lunch. One meal, one Birkat Hamazon for everyone sitting at the table. So for what you know about the Jewish world today, if I was going to say to Rabbi Rabinowitz, who is the current chief rabbi of the Kotel, if I said to him, guess what? The Messiah came, Rabbi Rabinowitz. We have to rebuild the third temple. And I'm a conservative rabbi. I'd like to know if members of my synagogue can daven at the temple too. What do you think Rabbi Rabinowitz would say to me? I wonder if he would follow the view of Rabbi Yossi or not. Something tells me not likely. Just yesterday, I don't know if some of you participated on the call with Natan Sharansky, but Natan Sharansky's what was his main project? I don't know if it was it was, let's say, the most publicized and controversial project that he took on as head of the Jewish Agency was to find a compromise at the Kotel. And just like Rabbi Yossi says in these sources, there's only one altar, and all Jews need to be able to share their food at the altar, or we're going to create two altars, and that would just be unthinkable for the Jews to have two altars. Well, friends, what was the compromise they came up with regard to the Kotel? If I remember correctly, it's that there will be two Kotels. You daven at yours, and we'll daven at ours, so that our plates can be holy, and your plates can be treif. But they're not going to mix together. One Kotel for the upper class, one Kotel for the lower class. In other words, the worst nightmare of Rabbi Yossi seems to be in many ways coming true. His voice is needed more than ever, I think. And maybe now that we have our group who have dedicated these weeks of study to appreciating the point of view of Rabbi Yossi and all of the efforts of great Jews across the centuries to build bridges and bring together people, whether it's around the table or around the courtroom or around Shabbat observance or around the synagogue, who have different practices. These great rabbis found ways to maintain Jewish unity. And they were not all left-wing rabbis. It was Rabbi Shlomo Zalman Auerbach that we learned last week. He's a Haredi posek who, for his own reasons, I give you that, built bridges. Well, at the end of the day, he did, and he used a methodology that we could use, if only we would be willing to compromise war and stand less on being pure ourselves. It is on that note that I want to end this class, in the hope that in an era where we are forced to be divided from one another, in these months where we've been forced to be separate, I'm with you that that's been hard and difficult and has not been fun. But the day is coming when we'll be able to be together again. The question is whether we will be, whether we will take advantage of those opportunities to be together, or whether we go back to our old ways of only inviting people to lunch who meet our standards. So I thank you deeply for joining me in this exploration of Jewish sources and I'm going to stop on this issue, and I'm going to stop the recording now so that